So, it's it's been about a couple years since I left Christianity, thankfully. And I feel very differently about Christianity now than I did a couple years ago. And one of the ways I feel differently is that I'm not nearly as angry as I used to be. Now, one thing that people may say to that is, "Congratulations, you've matured a little bit. You've kind of gotten past that," and that is a reaction I actually really hate. I don't really want that. I don't really want this change attributed to maturity, because it's really not. It's due to me being in a completely different place now than I was a couple years ago. I've defined my relationships since then. So a lot of my closest friends and family know exactly where I stand. I have gotten I've gotten quite a few atheist friends, so I kind of have a community and so on, and people that I can talk to inside this community and inside this group. At the same time, I'm not really part of a community per se. I like to think that I'm an individual, but there's a lot of things that I agree with these atheists about, so I am there to help them on the endeavors of the things we agree on. But I really think that, leaving Christianity, at least for me, was a very traumatic experience. And I think it's very important to realize that for a lot of atheists who are formerly Christians, leaving Christianity is a traumatic experience. And trying to say that trauma is an illegitimate reaction to leaving Christianity is something I really don't have any respect for, because it is clearly extremely traumatic, and saying that it shouldn't be doesn't dismiss the fact that it actually is. In many cases, not in all cases, but in many. And for those who, predominantly people who are not really very deeply Christian anyway, or who have been atheists their whole life, or who've been atheists for a significant amount of time, for those people, I would say try to put yourself in a strong religious person's shoes, right? All their relationships are probably defined by their religious stances. And so when they leave that, they're going through a very traumatic process. And because of the way that Christianity works, well, you're not really an atheist, and because people can be very patronizing and so on, it's often very necessary for you to stand up and say, "You know what? I am an atheist. And I don't believe any of this stuff, and I don't believe in hell or any of it. I don't believe it." Sometimes you have to stand up, and you have to be very strong, and you have to say, I didn't leave for that reason or that reason or that reason. I didn't believe just because leave because I'm a sinner. I am not a sinner. I left because what you believe is ridiculous and crazy and cruel. Sometimes you have to say that in order to define the relationships, in order to define yourself, not as somebody that is always pitied, but as somebody who is confident in exactly where they stand. And you have to do that for your own health, so that you don't always feel like a problem that everybody else has to solve. Because Christianity is one of those religions in which if you have a problem with doubt, it's okay to have a problem with doubt, but then everybody else has to play doctor and they have to fix you. So if you're trying to get out of that mode, you have to stand up for yourself and really say very insistently, and maybe sometimes somewhat angrily, "I am not looking to be fixed. I am not a problem, and I do not feel like a problem. I am confident with exactly where I stand." And I needed to see people like that coming out of Christianity, because I was afraid of coming out that I would be this major problem. And then I saw people like Christopher Hitchens, who I don't agree with everything he said, and let's face it, some of his arguments were bad and atrocious. But a lot of it, basically saying, I think religion is ridiculous, and I'm not going to apologize for thinking that, and it's not my problem, it is Christianity's problem. I think that is a necessary stance for a lot of people to take, especially when they're trying to define their relationships. And so when you get out of that, and when you start developing an identity outside of the church, and outside of Christianity, then it's a lot easier to be a lot more diplomatic. But when you first start, sometimes you have to be very insistent. So I think it's important to understand that. And I think the second thing is important to understand is that all this religious conditioning doesn't go away overnight. People seem to think that there's a flip that switches on where you're a Christian and bam, you're an atheist. And that's not exactly the case. I heard a story recently of somebody who, every time he said a certain word, his hands were slapped. And so after a while, he didn't say that word. And he grew up and he knew his hands wouldn't be slapped if he said the word, but he still couldn't say the word because of years and years of conditioning. You may know when you lose an arm, you may know that the arm's not there, but you still kind of feel like it's there. And so there might be an anger of, okay, that arm's not there. I have to figure out a different way to actually live my life now that this arm's not there. You have to understand, if you're an atheist, that a lot of these Christians who have been have been in a religion in which they have been depending on God completely. Like, God has been their everything, and they have gone to sermons week after week after week. And if you forget this, maybe go to a conservative church sometime and listen to one of these sermons. But they go to sermons week after week after week after week saying that nothing matters except for Christ. And so when they lose that, all of a sudden there's a vacuum. And to top it off, all these people are throwing these trigger words at them. If you have a abusive relationship with somebody who always calls you by the same name, who always calls you stupid or always calls you crazy, and that happens over and over and over and over again, and you get trapped in that abuse and you're trying to get out of that, and they say, well, you're crazy, it bothers you. And sometimes you need to get angry and speak up and say, that's not cool. And so I think that's not so much immaturity as much as it is just a natural psychological reaction to exactly what you're going through that is necessary for you to get out of the mentality that you've had and try to find a new one. Especially when people are throwing all these words at you, you need to sometimes say, it gives you courage to be able to look at that and say, I'm not going to hell, you're full of shit. It gives you wherewithal and courage, and it actually helps you try to, and it actually helps you build on a new foundation to reject the other one very strongly. I mean, you don't feel the same way about things all the time. You go through stages, you go through different processes, and more than just stages, you go through different reactions with different people in different situations. So I'm at a place in my life where I don't need to be angry all the time. Although I do feel, to be honest with you, an obligation to be angry. And the obligation is that I feel like because there are so many things that Christianity is doing wrong in the world that I should be generally upset about that. So sometimes, if anything, I feel guilty for not being angry enough. But I don't think lack of anger is a sign of maturity. And for people who say, well, you just want to be happy. No, I don't just want to be happy. I don't want to be ignorantly happy. That's not bliss to me. I would rather be honestly happy. And part of being honestly happy for me is trying to get a knowledge of the world, the way the world actually is. And instead of just resigning myself to thinking that I'm helpless, actually thinking that I can change something, and anger is something that can fuel that change. So hopefully that makes things somewhat clear. I'm in favor of a lot of different approaches. You know, I'm in favor of the peaceful approach, but I'm also in favor of the militant approach as far as atheism is concerned. I think that they both have things to convey to people who aren't believers. But more than that, you know, instead of just looking at, okay, how can we help these other people, there's no guarantee that you're ever going to convince somebody as an atheist to leave Christianity or to leave whatever religion you come from. There's no guarantee that you're going to do that. So while you're alive, and while there's no guarantee, you might as well just be honest with exactly who you are and where you stand, and state it without apology. And if you convince somebody, fine. If you don't, at least you're living life on your own terms. And at least you're setting boundaries where you need to set boundaries. And at least you are able to reject the concepts that once held you in bondage and held you in fear and held you in subservience, and patronization and control. So go ahead. Be angry.